Good afternoon, everyone. I'll start just by thanking the organizers of this event, John and Rosie, and the European Union for a kind and I must say somewhat surprising invitation to come speak this afternoon here at Europe House as a dual Swiss and American citizen who works at a Swiss bank.
You just got in, you scraped in.
So I will henceforth tell anyone who asks that the people at the EU clearly keep an open mind. Now, like many of you, I work in an environment where the price of failure is high. It's a bank, as Rosie said, Banque Cantonale Vaudoise, or BCV, as we call it, whence the suit. And it's extremely important to us that we get our multilingual communications right for several reasons. First, we're trying to sell stuff, right? And effective communication can help you do that. A few months ago, I spoke at a meeting of Google's translation team. I know people here think of Google as dark technology, but Google is also 60 translators on 5 continents, right? Worrying about some of the same issues we're worrying about today. And we talked about this issue of multilingual communications as a way of selling stuff. And we agreed that in banking and finance, the importance of communications is probably even greater than it is in the tech sector when it comes to making the sale, because unlike the stuff Google or Mac is selling, which is objectively pretty cool, the stuff banks are selling just isn't, right? And the stuff any one bank is selling isn't going to be that different from the stuff any other bank is selling. I mean, you do hear, especially among kids, people saying, I love my Android phone, right? Or I love my iPhone or something like that. Have any of you ever heard anyone say, I love my savings account? Me neither. So our marketing copy needs to be effective. It needs to push the right buttons. And it needs to push them across all the languages concerned, which at BCV primarily means, by the way, French, that's our base language, English and German. We translate just about everything into English because we're based in the Lake Geneva region, and that's very international. About a third of the population isn't Swiss and not native speakers of French. So our entire website, here's the homepage of BCV's website in French, we'll translate all of that, every single page, into English. Here's the homepage in English. And if you toggle a bit, though, you'll see there are some differences, right? That thing over there in the corner, welcome to Vaud, right? Practical information about settling into Vaud. That isn't in the French, right? I'll start by just saying that the idea for doing that, as well as the storyboard, and then of course the actual writing, but even the visual, that photo of the vineyards over Lake Geneva, which the average Swiss person would find horribly cliche, but which totally pushes the buttons of the Brits who've come to live in Switzerland or other foreign people, all of that was done by the translators. More on how that works later. We also translate a lot of our content into German. We sell asset management services to pension funds and other institutional investors in the German-speaking part of the country, and we choose to, as it were, talk to these people in German rather than talking to them in the sort of Euro-speak English that all the other international banks use. That's a differentiator for us. It underlines our Swissitude, and that's a good thing in the market in Zurich. And so it will take out ads in the German language press like that, which is on the front page of NZZ. And we'll also place articles in the specialized financial press, like this article here in FUV, and all of that is, of course, translated. We also translate for investors. That is to say, not people to whom we're trying to sell stuff, but people to whom we are trying to sell the BCV share itself. We're trying to get them to invest in the bank. The art of talking to these people is known as investor relations. And here, the price of failure in our translations, and by failure I would obviously understand inaccuracies, but also any inauthenticity in the language, anything that makes us sound unprofessional or like a bad investment, may well be even higher than is the price of failure in our marketing and sales support stuff. But when things go well, we can use the language in this stuff to push investors' buttons too. Here's a quarterly results disclosure. That's finance jargon for a press release. saying how well the bank did, how much money they made or lost, what their overall financial position is, and banks and other companies, listed companies, have to release these every quarter. Investors and other market observers pay attention to this stuff. If your results are up, your company's share price will go up. If your results are down, the share price will go down. And actually, your credit rating can go up and down as well. If your credit rating goes down, it gets harder and more expensive for the bank to borrow money. And so that compresses what's known as the interest rate spread, or the yield differential, between how much it costs us to borrow money and the exorbitant rates we charge all of you for your mortgages. So this stuff can have very concrete effects. As can words, right? Words matter. As translators, we know this. And when we choose in a financial reporting press release like this one to render something like this, right? So our strong results confirme la confiance de la clientèle. When we choose to render that like this in English, right, talking about a customer franchise, and that might seem to many of you to be a little bit debatable as a translation choice, right? But as a matter of fact, I would submit that this language is a bit more in line with how financial markets actually talk about this sort of thing. In fact, customer franchise is a bit of a buzzword, and so we can use that buzzword, and this is where it gets interesting for the bank, to spin the perception a little bit. Part of the rationale for translating this stuff into English is that it allows us to plant certain terms, our terms, in the heads of market observers like Standard & Poor's or Moody's, two rating agencies you might have heard about. And that means we set the terms in which we get talked about, right? Because those rating agencies are going to be doing all of their talking and all of their reading in English. And it works. We started using this as a formulation in about 2009. By 2011, Moody's had picked it up. And Standard & Poor's is still using it a couple months ago. So those are some of the reasons why we translate at BCV. Customers, counterparties, corporate image. And in any of these areas, the price of failure to communicate, any failure to communicate is high. But so are the payoffs when you do it right. So what that means is that at Banque Cantonale Vaudoise, we'll spend what we need to spend in terms of money, of course, but also time, resources, talent, to ensure that we succeed at least most of the time in producing content that is, of course, consistent across all the languages involved, but also, and this is my point really, effective as communication across all the languages involved. And as we all know as translators, there is sometimes a tension between those two things. So our quality question at BCV is never going to be, is this a good translation? Our quality question is going to be, is this effective communication, right? We don't like the question, is this a good translation? Because we think formulating it that way contains a lot of implicit ready-made excuses for content that's less than effective. You know what I'm talking about, excuses like, oh, the source text said this, the source text said that, it wasn't clear, it was difficult to render elegantly in the target language, etc., etc., etc. We've all been there. What I can tell you is that as head of multilingual content at a bank, if someone comes to me with that, honestly, I don't care. If you're my translator, you've got to get all that junk straightened out with the owner of the original text. You've got to make the changes that are necessary to make your stuff work as writing, and you've got to have the owner of the original text totally buy into the changes that you've made. Your job's done when all that's done, when it's effective communication, and when the text owner thinks so too. Especially if you've ended up messing around a little bit with what she originally had, right? That's kind of a tall order. Both in terms of people and skills, and in terms of processes, and I'm going to spend the rest of my talk today unpacking that a little bit. I'm hoping you'll think it's worth your time, if only because the approach worked in at least one place, and that's our place with our in-house team. Because although right now in 2014, things look pretty good at BCV, at least from the outside, it hasn't always been that way. Right now, lots of people want to work for us. Salaries are up since the mid-2000s, which is nice. The UN tried to hire my senior German translator twice in the last 18 months. Both times we outspent them. I'll admit it, it felt good. So, you know, we have pretty good relationships with our internal clients. Our reputation within the bank is of a high-functioning unit. Once in a while, relatively frequently, I get invited to talk about how we position ourselves, how we re-engineered our processes at events like these. I am no longer scared of the CEO. So, you know, on a lot of objective metrics, things seem to look pretty good. And you can almost forget that less than a decade ago, our team at BCV was totally isolated and had a pretty cruddy brand image within the bank, actually. And we were actually about this close to getting outsourced or offshored or whatever the guys at McKinsey would have decided to do. Plus, worst of all, a lot of the English and German content we produced wasn't actually all that snazzy as prose, right? And that really gets you, right, as a language professional, doesn't it? It wasn't entirely our fault. The multilingual communications business processes BCV had put in place weren't conducive to doing high-level work. But if that's your job, if that's your product, whether it's 100% your fault or not, if at the end of the day what you're coming out with isn't good, that is obviously discouraging, right? So 10 years ago, I would say that the BCV translation team was by no means future-proof. And we were having enough trouble just getting through the present. We managed not to get outsourced, but we did actually lose 25% of our positions. So things at BCV 10 years ago were very much less rosy than they are at the European Union right now. I would say that it would appear that this sort of precarious situation is relatively common among in-house teams. A lot of them are on the cusp, right? And as soon as there's a revenue crisis at the company, they're just right there, ready to get pushed over the edge into being downsized or outsourced. It's happening right now at two international organizations that I could mention but won't in Geneva. So how do you go from a precarious position like that to, as an in-house team, a position where you feel relatively future-proof? I'll provisionally accept that term. One thing I think you can do is take the idea of differentiation seriously on at least two levels. The first level is so fundamental, I think it's almost existential for the thinking, at least of an in-house team, and the second level is more of a process point. So first, let's consider differentiation as a fundamental economic concept. You know, if you start a new company, any company, a lemonade stand, and you go to a bank for financing, the bank will not give you any money unless you can tell them what sets you apart from the competition, right? Because the bank is aware that there are other lemonade stands out there. As an in-house team at BCV, we needed then to ask ourselves, what can we do for BCV by virtue of being an in-house team that nobody on the outside could ever do for them? To put it another way, Paul, in my business McKinsey jargon, how can we leverage the fact that we are under the same roof as our clients? And so that's one fundamental question that 10 years ago we needed to find a good answer to, and apparently at the time we didn't have one. How can we make it worth BCV's while to work with us and not to work with someone else? Part of the answer to that, I think, lies in the notion of differentiation, but on another level. Process differentiation, right? We quickly realized that as an in-house team, we weren't going to be able to differentiate ourselves durably based on criteria like unit cost, time to delivery, volume management. Somebody out there, TransPerfect, Lionbridge, whoever your local translation Walmart's is going to be cheaper, faster, more readily, eternally, I'm tempted to say, abjectly available than any in-house team can be, and indeed any high-end translator ever wants to be. I think this goes for external providers too. So we didn't want to go down the path of conceiving of translation primarily or even importantly as a commodity, because then our career path would look like the career path of a coffee bean picker. But we did think that we could differentiate ourselves in a durable sort of way from external competition by identifying a short list of what you might call image-critical content for our bank, and then building processes that would allow us to translate that content in a way that could get it to a higher level of quality than anything BCV could possibly get from external providers, no matter how much better and smarter they were than we are. And I'm sure there are a lot of external providers out there who are indeed better and smarter than us. Now, what I mean by quality obviously goes back about 2 slides. What I'm talking about is quality conceived of in terms of effective communication. Now, just a caveat here, we're not going to do everything this way, right? Just the tippy top of the pyramid. We're differentiating our levels of quality. Everybody does that. But the idea was to stretch the scale of differentiation at the high end, to not be afraid, talk about splitting an infinitive, of committing exponentially more resources, or at the very least geometrically more resources, to a short list of texts, of content, that's critical for the image of your organization and or critical for the brand positioning, the brand image of your team within that organization. And we thought that there you could leverage some of the things that are the case if you're in-house, particularly the fact that you can have face-to-face contact with your clients. So these processes that we built for the tippy top of the pyramid, they have a lot of moving parts, and I don't have enough time to talk about them all today. So I'm going to touch on just a couple of aspects, the ones that I thought related most closely to this idea of future-proofing the profession, particularly in the face of technological advance, because I saw the questions, a lot of people seem to be worried about that, or at least interested in it. So first off, one of the resources you have to not be afraid to commit a lot more of is talent, translator talent, and in particular, writing skills. Now, that sounds boring and schoolmarmish, but there it is. Not everyone can write compelling prose, so while being a native speaker of the language in question is a necessary condition for high-end financial translation, and I will put myself out there and say I think it is by no means sufficient. You've got to be someone who stands out among other native speakers for your writing skills, your sharp editing, your verbal creativity, and your articulateness. The difference between you, the high-level professional in your language, and the average native speaker of that language should be roughly akin to the difference between being a cardiologist and having a pulse. So, at BCV, we needed to rethink what we were looking for in our hiring decisions. For starters, no more bilinguals. But more generally, we started looking for people with an acute sense of what reads well and a knack for turning nifty phrases in their target language. And people like that are expensive. So the second resource you need not to be afraid to commit more of is money. For English, this was particularly tough for us in Lausanne, Switzerland, right? I mean, native English speakers are kind of thin on the ground over there. And so when you don't have a deep talent pool, it's hard to find really good. We actually ended up using a headhunter firm to recruit an English translator a few years back, which is an indication of a change in the perceived value of the function in the organization, right? When that happened, when human resources was up for that, I knew things were starting to turn in our favor. But even the headhunter firm ended up having to go to New York to get the guy. To get the guy with the writing skills, the command of French, and the knowledge of finance that we were looking for. So great, very nice. However, those translators, the ones we want, the ones with the really good writing skills, actually, in my experience, are the ones that tend to cause the most trouble and have the most problems with their internal clients. Why? Here I think no one less eminent than Dr. Samuel Johnson can help us out. I'll let you savor that. So Samuel Johnson, author of the first dictionary of English, in the 1760s, writing Lives of the Poet, writes, "When languages are formed upon different principles, it is impossible that the same modes of expression should always be elegant in both. While they run together, the closest translation may be considered as the best. But when they divaricate, each must take its natural course." Isn't divaricate wonderful? Now, lest you think my talk has not been sufficiently cultivating this afternoon, to Dr. Johnson I will add John Dryden. Right? It appears necessary that a man should be a nice critic in his own tongue before he attempts to translate a foreign language. Now I'm scaring you now, aren't I? with all the 17th and 18th century stuff. No worries. My point is simple. It's twofold, but relatively simple. First off, you can't always say exactly the same thing in exactly the same way and have it work exactly as well in two different languages. Even two languages as closely related as French and English. And I won't mention 1066 because I don't want y'all on my back. Second, well, let me just say, sometimes, of course, you can, particularly between two languages as closely related as French and English. But sometimes you can't. More times than I think the average translator is aware of. Sometimes the two languages must, as Dr. Johnson put it, divaricate. Second point, and here we lean on Dryden a bit, in order to know when you should, as it were, divaricate, you need a very strong sense of style in your target language. You need real expertise, the kind of expertise that would allow you to know, if your target language happens to be English, and I think that's the case for the majority of us today, that by nice, a late 17th century writer would have meant refined, right? Someone with an exquisitely refined sensibility in English. Now it follows from this that translators with mediocre writing skills and a relatively impoverished sensibility in their target language are actually generally going to be more comfortable with closer translations, right? Their target language stylistic compass isn't quite pointing north anyway, right? So it's more easily tugged in the direction of the source text and the source language. That's the best metaphor I can come up with. They don't feel the need to divaricate as often as they should. And unfortunately, more often than not, the client, be she external or internal, is happy with that. Because clients like it when they find the structures and even the words of their original, and they find it comforting, right? Reassuring. Now, in contrast, translators who have a real feel for their target language are going to have a harder time translating literally or even closely. I would submit the hypothesis that their more acute sensibility in the target language makes them more painfully aware of just how bad, how ineffective is communication a lot of close translation is. So it's that category of translator, the latter category, the guys we want, who are going to cause more trouble, right? Because they'll be changing more stuff. It's as simple as that. And clients don't like their stuff to get changed, all right? So this needs to be managed. So that's another moving part in our process at BCV. Translators like this need to have face time with their clients so they can explain what they're doing and why. And also, so that they can get any additional information they need to make the target text really work, right? And I'll take the case of French and English, because it's the only language combination I know anything at all about. A good translator, one who can write, is going to need a lot more time and place information than she's likely to have gotten from the original French text in many places, right? So that she can turn some nouns into verbs, right? Those of you who work in this field know exactly what I'm talking about. And when she does that, know what tenses and aspects to use and what agent to predicate all those shiny new verbs of. You can't get this unless you don't ask, so you're not going to get it unless you have a Q&A enabled client relationship. It's that simple. That way our translator, our putative translator, can avoid literal renderings like that one. Won't you read that? I'm not going to put the original French up because we don't even need it, do we? Now, this is a page 2 pull quote from the annual report of a large Swiss technology company. Okay? So they have clearly missed a chance to be impactful here in a place where they should be impactful. They've missed a chance to sound dynamic. But if you ask them a couple questions, maybe you can get to something like that, right? This way the company might sound a bit more dynamic. It'll talk about itself in the first person, might create that inclusive first and second person space that Anglo companies use as a space to sell stuff, right? So how do you get there? Well, FaceTime is going to be crucial to that. Really close. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so I didn't break it.
It's old technology.
Can you still hear me?
Yeah.
It's of course also crucial, however, that the client come out of that FaceTime, that encounter, satisfied with what happened and convinced that the translator has added value to our project. So the translator is going to need, not just getting to the meeting, the translator will need meeting skills, for lack of a better term. Skills that will allow her to learn how to project the sort of expertise that'll get the client to buy into what you're doing when you switch things around. So two key process elements that we needed to build in at VCV were FaceTime and training and meeting skills to make that FaceTime pay off. Because while the actual quality of what we do, whether it reads well, whether it's accurate, is very important, I think crucially important to all of us in terms of our own personal job satisfaction, perceived quality is at least equally important, maybe even more important when you're dealing with an in-house team and when you're trying to develop your own corporate survival skills. Now there's a lot I could say about managing perceived quality, but I don't think there's time. But I want to circle back to this idea of meeting and meeting skills and talk about that just for a second. Because I think translators on the whole are actually pretty miserable at meetings. There's some interesting reasons for this. I think there's a certain selection bias in the population of people who choose to become translators against folks who like to put themselves out there, right? I mean, there's a reason you didn't become a writer but became a translator, and putting yourself out there is part of working in a meeting. But anyway, let's just take that as a given. At VCV, we feel it's a given. But it's not something that you can or should just ignore. I mean, this is stuff that can be coached, that can be worked on, okay? Gurley said, the range of competencies that's necessary is large, okay? Meeting skills is part of it. At VCV, our translators routinely walk into meetings with senior management. I'm talking about a meeting between a translator and the CEO or the CFO of a large listed company in Switzerland. Those meetings have got to be productive, because if they're not, they will not happen again, all right? And some of our senior management are native speakers of the languages concerned. Our current CFO is German. Our previous head of wealth management was a Brit. And in a meeting, let's take the example of a meeting between one of my German translators and the German language CFO. It's got to be clear from the very beginning in that meeting who the real German language expert is. All right? That's just got to emerge. Concretely, if they're working on a press release like the one I showed you earlier, and something doesn't work, the CEO says, no, I don't think the German's saying what we said in French, etc., and they start brainstorming about it, then it's absolutely crucial that my guy be able, in real time, in the heat of the moment, to come up with more synonyms, more rephrasings, more reformulations, faster than the German language CFO. Now, I know it's not real, it's all about perception, but it's so important, because the CFO's being paid to run the bank. My guy's being paid to be the German language specialist, and then the CFO decides, I've got to do that too, then I'm going to have a big problem. So this is a highly stressful situation for a translator, but it is something that can be trained for, way upstream, and it's something that can be prepared for only a little bit upstream. If you sit down beforehand as a college of German translators and say, okay, this is the press release, image critical text for us, it's about our brand within the organization, let's think of alternatives. Okay? But your boss has to be willing to let you, as it were, waste that time. So there we are, back to geometrically more, exponentially more resources on certain types of tests. Not being afraid to stretch your resource allocation at the high end. And when you think about it, BCV as a bank is doing that too, right? BCV is willing to allocate CFO time to translations and CEO time to translations. And senior management time is rather more expensive than translator time. So that says something too. It might even be one reason why that doesn't happen very often at listed companies. You don't have too many companies where the translators walk into meetings with the CEO and CFO. It's hard to get meetings with these people. But honestly, I think another reason, in all modesty, is that not many in-house teams have tried it. They've tried to get in, and not many in-house teams have trained their people to ensure that when that meeting happens once, the translator is going to get invited back, given that the woman or the man on the other side of the table is usually very impatient. So you've got that going on too. It took us about 5 years to get there. We worked our way up through lower level meetings, and it was absolutely crucial that the people on the other side of the table in those lower level meetings walked out of the meeting, with the impression that they understood why you messed with your content. Not only did they understand it, but they were also impressed with your knowledge of their field, your commitment to helping them attain your goals, your surprisingly deep understanding for those goals in a world where a lot of business people say, les traducteurs, ce sont tous des poètes, right? Translators just don't get it, they don't understand business. Which brings me to my last point, which is specialization. Because specialization is a big part of this, right? It's another one of the moving parts in our system at BCV, but I think it's something that everybody here who's looking to have a high-end, reasonably future-proofed career needs to take seriously. It's a basic fact of economic life, right? If your knee hurts, you might go to your GP, or I don't know what you guys call GP in British English, but your family doctor, and get some Advil or something like that. But if it keeps hurting, you won't go back to your GP, right? You go to the orthopedic surgeon. And if you need an operation, you would do well to ask that orthopedic surgeon whether he's really a knee guy or whether he's a shoulder guy, right? So specialization is out there, and we all know it. And so it surprises me sometimes that so many translators think they get a free pass on this fundamental fact of economic life. If you want to be in the premium market, you need to specialize. I think translators very often are people who didn't know what to read or to major in at university because everything interested them. I mean, I was like that. I think a lot of us are like, but you do have to make choices however much it hurts. The noted financial translator Christine Durbin has said that you're not a specialized financial translator unless it's something you're doing 40 hours a week. So that means, for instance, that the 30% of my time I spend at the University of Geneva is actually having a negative impact on my skills as a financial translator, and it's just true. I'm not as good as I could or perhaps should be. So if you want to get into the premium market, I would say that's the first thing that you need to do. My takeaways then for today, we were asked to leave concrete takeaways, right? The first one then is that contrary to the sort of lamentations of Jeremiah ethos that I think some translator groups are sort of bathing in, that everything is bad, the bulk market, machine translation, etc., I would like to say that the premium market is out there and it's actually growing. Its future doesn't feel threatened to me. I would totally agree with Burley there. Okay? Now, my view of this is necessarily very occluded, far more occluded than the other two speakers today. I'm just talking about one small slice and trying to give you a case study of that. And you'll have to extrapolate from what I've said, and I hope see one or two things that might be applicable. But there are, I think, a lot of other premium markets that are out there, like the EUs, right? I mean, in many respects, they represent the pinnacle of our profession. I kind of doubt that, contrary to what I've said about how we work at BCV, at the EU, translators should rewrite treaties to make them sound better in the target language. But I don't know, because I'm not specialized in that and wouldn't or shouldn't presume to talk about it. If you could rewrite treaties in the target language, maybe we Swiss might one day sign up. We are currently attempting to rewrite a couple treaties, as you may be aware. So that would be the first takeaway. The second is that doing this, working in the premium market in a relatively future-proof situation, is then predicated on attaining a very high degree of specialization. And I will leave the door open for a rebuttal by saying that this degree of specialization is something that I think many academics in translation studies are unaware of. Simply by virtue of the fact that if you're a full-time academic, you can't do Christine Durbin's 40 hours. And a corollary of this is then that although I think translation MA programs are fantastic and essential, and that they get bad-mouthed unfairly in trade conferences of practicing translators like the one I just got back from in Brussels, you need to add other stuff to them, because I think a lot of the people in the programs aren't going to be aware of this premium market because, well, they're occupied with other things. And those things prevent them from attaining the level of specialization that is requisite for working in the premium market. So I would say that. Finally, two last things. As I said, working in these markets is predicated on being an extremely gifted writer, an editor and talker, as it were a cardiologist in your native language. And the last thing is that it's predicated on setting up dialogue-based processes with your clients. I refer to them as Q&A enabled or give and take enabled processes, right? Now thinking about this in terms of future-proofing is kind of interesting because it seems to me that if you do that, then your career as a translator, or perhaps more accurately, a translator / multilingual content creator or recreator, is relatively future-proof because it's unlikely that machines will be able to sit down and talk with their clients anytime soon. And if I'm wrong about that one, then I think translation will be the least of our problems. Thanks very much.